everything. I think that culture of saying, well, you work for a law firm, therefore we own you in your entirety and all of your personal time is flawed. And I think it's right that Gen Z is standing up and saying, actually, this is a job, it's not our life. And we do have to have some boundaries around where work ends and life begins. Otherwise, we end up burnt out in a mental health crisis. So I think it's positive what they're bringing. It's just getting the lines right, I think.
Welcome back to the Charlene and Gisele show. Today is a very special milestone. It is our 50th podcast episode. And I want to take a moment to thank you, my dear, amazing listeners, for all your support, your messages, and for tuning in with me every Wednesday. I'm thrilled to mark this milestone with a fantastic guest today, Chrissie Wolfe, a true powerhouse in the legal world and beyond. Chrissie is an award winning solicitor, now a partner, and the founder of the hit YouTube channel Law and Broader, as well as a legal vlogger of the year and a mentor to rising legal stars. In today's episode, we will dive into how Gen Z is reshaping the workplace, the challenges of retaining talent, Chrissie's unique perspective on the future of leadership and law, as well as her insights on how to navigate an ADHD diagnosis. This conversation is packed with insights, inspiration, and a fresh take on the challenging dynamics of modern careers in law. Please remember, if you haven't done this already, to follow, subscribe, and give us a rating. It would mean so much and truly helps us grow the show and serve you in the best possible way every week. Thank you. Chrissie, good morning. I know that you have been quite the busy woman, just coming out of Legal Geeks. You have the bracelet on your wrist. Tell us more.
Yes, so I'm in the midst of the Legal Geek conference. It's a 2-day conference. So I started yesterday. I did my talk yesterday, and then I'm back for day 2 of the conference today. But luckily, this is slightly more of a chilled day because I've already done my speech, which is nice.
I love that your definition of chilled is running to a podcast, running to a conference, being a keynote speaker, catching a train home tonight. That's chilled, right?
That is quite chill for me. Yeah, I do try and pack a lot in, to be honest, especially when I'm in London, as I'm not London based. So whenever I've got time in London, I do kind of overfill my diary, let's say.
Well, I'm so grateful that you made time for us today. Chrissie, I really want to dive into one of the topics that I know you are an ambassador and an expert in is the Gen Z and the law, and also any advice that you would give either for law firms working with Gen Z and who want to retain these talents, and also perhaps educate us as to what Gen Z really want.
So Gen Z are kind of a Marmite generation. I think people tend to either love them or hate them. And I think, to start off, it's kind of, we're making huge generalizations here when we talk about a generation. And as with a lot of people, if you've met one Gen Z, you've met one Gen Z. There is no kind of way of necessarily grouping everyone together in the same way, but there are certainly a lot of traits that we are seeing in this generation which are very different to generations that we've seen before. And I think there's a number of different reasons for that, from a kind of perspective of how this generation have grown up. I mean, they are the first internet generation. And I think that accounts for a huge amount in their different perspective in terms of how they view the world. I think when you look at how generations before have grown up, we've grown up pretty much with our main influences being our immediate surroundings. So our parents, the people who lived on our street, the people we went to school with, then the people we went to university with, our teachers, our parents' friends, for example. Those are the influences that we have had. Whereas this generation have grown up with the entirety of the internet as their influence. And a lot of their role models are not their parents or their brothers and sisters or their friends at school. They're people like Stephen Bartlett and Grace Beverley and influencers who have very different perspectives on life. And I think that does account for a huge amount of why Gen Z think the way that they do, because they do have these much wider influences beyond their immediate circle, which I think is a really positive thing, actually, especially for social mobility and inclusion and diversity. We've actually got people from, all sorts of different backgrounds backgrounds who have got these role models and actually see people like them growing up and achieving incredible things. And I think it's a really positive thing. But I think actually having that kind of spread of information and breadth of information from quite a young age is also quite overwhelming.
Sure.
And I think because of having that kind of level of information, that's really kind of crafted how they view the world and what they will tolerate and what they will accept, because they've also seen people saying, they've seen, particularly in the law, they've seen the stats around mental health, and they've seen a lot of the unhappiness that our generations have faced and said, we don't want to do that. Actually, we don't accept that. We know that there is better. We know that there are people out here who are not experiencing that. There's different models, there's different ways of working. And it isn't just across law, that's across all sorts of employment frameworks. But I think having that knowledge and being able to actually read up on companies and understand what's going on and knowing there's so much more choice and alternatives. I think this generation is just so much more empowered than any generation before to actually say, no, I don't accept that way. I want to do it differently. And I know it can be done differently. Yeah. And I think that can rub other generations up the wrong way.
Well, it is. I also wanted to really ask you a question there, at the risk of overgeneralizing, of course. What I hear often from partners working at leading law firms talking about Gen Z is it's hard to get them to work as hard as perhaps previous generation have. And of course, I'm very aware of, overgeneralization, and I don't want to put everyone in the same basket, but a typical feedback that I get from a partner when I walk into a law firm to do a well-being workshop is, please, no more well-being. They already are so obsessed with their wellness. We actually want them to perhaps, push themselves a little harder. And I find those conversations really interesting because back in my days, well-being was not a consideration, but that's also how I burnt out. So there must be a happy medium. Do you have a sense what that looks like, what that feels like? Are we taking well-being too far? Where are we?
Yeah, great question. So I've done quite a lot of work, particularly in the legal space, around consulting around how to kind of bridge that generational gap between this generation coming through. And we're now in a kind of culture where we've got workforces spanning 5 generations. And so the particular gap is between the kind of Gen Zs coming through at the entry-level roles, and then you've got the partners and the directors and the C-suite who are at the 5th generation at the top, and that gap can be really big, actually.
Really big.
And I think in terms of the work side of things, I think it comes down to how you inspire the workforce, because I actually think Gen Z are more hardworking than a lot of other generations, but they have a lot of things that they want to work on. So I think there's a misconception that Gen Z want to leave the office at 5 p.m. and go chill. They don't. They want to start their side hustle at 5 p.m. It's, these are people who are, they've got multiple social media platforms. They're probably selling stuff on eBay. They've probably got some kind of other initiative that they're working on in their spare time.
They have a podcast.
They have a podcast. Yeah, it's not that they are lazy. It's that they have a lot of demands on their attention. And actually, they only want to dedicate 8 hours a day to their day job because they've got a number of other things that they want to do.
Right.
And I think that's also a function of having been inspired by lots of people like the Stephen Bartletts of the world who have lived that life and said, actually, you can have all of this. You can have 1 million followers, and you can have $1 billion company, and you can have a podcast, and you can have this, and you can have a well-being company, and all of these things. And I think that's inspired that generation to think like that and say, actually, a day job is just one of the 10 things that you can do with your life. And it's almost that attitude that shouldn't take up all of your time. So, but I think the companies that are inspiring Gen Z and can provide a lot of things within that employment framework are actually getting a huge amount of productivity from Gen Z. So I think those that are supporting them with their side hustles and saying, hey, bring that, let's work with that, and are working with that kind of almost surplus of attention that we've got in this generation, which is another issue altogether. And I think that's driven by social media and a number of things. But I think actually if you can capitalize on that kind of excess of attention and harness it on the job that you want them to do, I think you can have a really, really productive workforce from Gen Z. But I think that in how to inspire them, they're not being inspired, basically, to kind of give their energy to their day job. And I think that's where you need really, really good leadership. And I think that's where a lot of particularly corporates fall down, is not having really inspirational leadership. And I think that's really key to inspiring a generation, is having those strong leaders who really understand people, who really understand the vision for the company and their individual role within that vision. I think particularly corporates have a tendency to put people in cogs and not really give people kind of their individuality and show them how they are specifically adding value to the company. They get this feeling that they're very replaceable. And actually, if they feel like they quit tomorrow and they're going to be replaced by Friday, why would they stay beyond 5 p.m.? Yeah. You know, because why would they? Why would they work any more than they have to? Why wouldn't they work beyond their contractual hours if they're not getting overtime to stay past 5 p.m. and they're not being, in any way valued for that? It's just accepted that you would have to work beyond your contractual hours. There's no incentive there, and there's too many other incentives for Gen Z to do too many other things for them to stay in a role which they're not incentivized to stay in.
I feel like I have to play devil's advocate here.
Yep.
So let's say I have some pretty firm objections to all of that based on the fact that I'm a partner at a law firm, and I think, well, the role is already so intense as it is. Knowing that you have a side hustle and other interests actually concerns me because I want you to be on top of your billables, etc. What would you say to help bridge that generational gap to that partner, to actually influence them in a positive way and be perhaps more welcoming to a more diverse pool of talent?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have a pretty strong recruitment strategy. And I think that's where a lot of it falls down as well, in terms of companies advertising for, they want people who are creative and entrepreneurial, and then they put them in a role which is, you have to bill 10 hours a day and sit behind your desk. And actually, you're then going to get that mismatch, because you're going to get people who have very creative ideas, but you're not actually providing an inclusive environment for those people to thrive. So you have to be clear in your job description about what your expectations are. If your job, if you are working in, if the job description is, it's a US law firm and we expect you to work all hours of the day, you are always on, these are going to be your targets, and, you will be remunerated with X, however many hundreds of thousands for that per year, then I think you will get people who are prepared to do that.
Sure.
I think the problem is where you get law firms who try to kind of advertise as being well-being friendly, and we've got all these initiatives and all of these things, and then Gen Z come in and actually they're not really being given those things. It's actually still, you're expected to work this many hours and into your free time and do all of this BD and all of these extra things, when actually that isn't really what was advertised. And I think there's a mismatch sometimes between what's being advertised and what's being delivered, and that's why there's quite high attrition rates. So I think it's being really honest about what expectations are. And I think in terms of where expectations might change, let's say, for example, you're expected to work, broadly 9-10 hours a day, for example, if there's going to be a change in that, being really transparent about why that is, and saying, if you are going to have to work until 2 a.m. Every night this week because we've got a big deal, then say you can leave at 3 p.m. every day next week to make up for that. And I think if that's not what's been set as the expectation, if there is something that goes beyond that, it's being fair about that. And I think it's also understanding that people have lives, and it's reasonable to have lives outside of your day job, and actually kind of being reasonable about saying, if you are going to have to come in super early one day or stay super late another day, actually giving a bit of notice around that, and not just kind of expecting people to drop everything. I think that culture of saying, well, you work for a law firm, therefore we own you in your entirety and all of your personal time is flawed. And I think it's right that Gen Z is standing up and saying, actually, this is a job, it's not our life, and we do have to have some boundaries around where work ends and life begins. Otherwise, we end up burnt out in a mental health crisis. So I think it's positive what they're bringing. It's just getting the lines right, I think.
And you've just brought up the topic of burnout and mental health crisis. Can you tell us more, either your own personal journey or clients you've worked with? I would really love to hear a bit more about what burnout has looked like and felt like for you.
Yeah, so I definitely did experience burnout. I think potentially I don't know whether there is kind of a typical version of burnout, but I would say mine was much more so burnout, not from the amount I was doing, but from doing a lot of work that I didn't find particularly inspiring. And I think from my experience anyway, burnout is typically associated with you're doing too much, you're working too many hours, you're not getting enough sleep. And actually that can be one element of it from my experience. But the other element is that you're just kind of uninspired by what you're doing. You don't have to be working 12-hour days. You can only be working 7-8 hour days. But if you're just relentlessly doing work which really, doesn't engage you, doesn't inspire, you can get burnt out from that kind of repeated work. And that's actually kind of what happened to me, to be honest, during the pandemic. Which I think happened to a lot of people. Our systems, obviously everything had to go online, and our systems weren't really cut out. I was working for a law firm at the time, and our systems weren't really cut out for online, as they weren't cut out to be fully digital. We had a combination of paper-based files and online case management system, but a lot of the important work was in paper files, and the kind of version of getting that to work with the pandemic was just scanning in all of those paper files into PDFs. So I spent months of the first sort of half of lockdown basically just kind of control Fing through like 2,000-page PDFs to try and find stuff that I needed. And I had a really big caseload. I really needed to get on with the actual work. And I just found it really frustrating kind of working within that system. And I'd been working for that firm for a long time anyway. And I'd thought it was going to be time soon for me to change and do something different. I think that kind of just pushed me over the edge, just the pandemic and kind of being forced into kind of working remotely, which I didn't enjoy. I was, I'm a people person. I really thrive off other people's energy, and actually kind of being forced to work from home. And that was nobody's fault, of course. That was just something that happened. But I think that combination of factors, kind of losing that office time, losing that sociability, and also kind of the work changing away from what I thought was kind of real lawyering, which I actually enjoyed, to basically just doing a whole load of what was essentially admin in terms of trying to work out that kind of change between formerly being kind of hybrid paper and digital, and then being fully digital in a system that wasn't really cut out for it. I found that really, really difficult. And that was actually what pushed me to then set up my own company halfway through lockdown in early 2021. I left the law firm and I set up my consulting business.
And I find that amazing in terms of, what we have in common. Interestingly enough, and I hope you don't mind me saying that, our path to recovery from burnout has been becoming entrepreneurial in many ways. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And I think that a lot of that comes down to a lot of the corporate structures not really working for me in terms of structure. And I then was later diagnosed with ADHD, which I didn't know I had, but it makes a lot of sense to me actually why I did feel very burnt out within the kind of corporate framework, and why, since I've been able to set up my own company and work in ways that work for me, work in locations that work for me, build, kind of recruit around my skill set, all of those things, that's been hugely beneficial for me in terms of my happiness and productivity. So I can see now why I burnt out in that structure completely, albeit I didn't really know it in that level of detail at the time because I didn't have the diagnosis.
I would really love to explore that theme, because you've been so brave and courageous about going public with this diagnosis. And I think we really need these ambassadors in our legal community, because there is still some stigma attached. And I'm thinking currently about at least 3 of my clients that are really, rock star lawyers, and they suspect they do have ADHD. And that's one of the reasons they came to see me. But the one thing they're really navigating at the moment is, would I be perceived as less capable, or would I be perceived differently? And this is not my opinion, of course, but this is what they fear. Can you tell us more? Did you feel that way at any given point? And perhaps could you tell us more about what are the key hallmarks of ADHD? And if somebody is listening in doubt, what would you want them to know?
Yeah. So lots of questions there. So I wasn't diagnosed until after I left private practice and set up my own consulting business. So I didn't have that dilemma of kind of, should I disclose or not, because I was already self-employed by the time that I was diagnosed. But I have had this conversation with people, and I think it's completely understandable, particularly in very competitive arenas like law, where actually, there's 2,000 candidates applying for 5 positions when at the trainee contract level. Not wanting to disclose anything that could potentially be perceived as a weakness is completely understandable. And I think for a long time that would have been sort of an understandable fear. And I've had lots of friends who've had very bad experiences a long time ago with who have been dyslexic and who have had various other kind of neurodiversities, and it hasn't gone well. With disclosing, I think we have moved on, particularly in the last 2 years. I think we have moved on a lot from that. I do think now a lot of firms are prioritising recruiting a diverse workforce that includes neurodiversity. And I actually think in many cases, you might find firms are really receptive to it and actually say, we want that diversity. It's understood that, yes, there will be some challenges, but there will also be some huge benefits, which there are with ADHD. It's a real double-edged sword in terms of, one, there are some things which you have complete executive dysfunction around, and it really does feel like a disability. But there are some things which you then also have kind of hyperability around. And it's actually kind of being able to harness that in a way that maximizes the hyperability and kind of minimizes the disability side of things. And actually, if you can provide a working environment which is tailored to the individual, then you really can do that. And I've tried my best to do that. I mean, I can't guarantee every day I'm at hyperability. I wish I could. But certainly tailoring my lifestyle and the way that I work has made me maximize the hyperability and try and minimize those executive dysfunction.
Can you tell us more, perhaps on a day-to-day basis, if you don't mind, what would be the biggest challenges and what would be the biggest superpowers that you derive out of ADHD, because you do have superpowers?
Yeah. For sure. I think I've chosen not to medicate, actually. So I don't have any medication for my ADHD. I've chosen to try and lifestyle manage as much as possible. So I would say for me, it's all about dopamine regulation, which is fundamentally what it is. It's an irregulation of dopamine. And that presents differently in everyone. Again, you meet one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. So it does present very differently. And particularly in men and women, it presents very differently. So men...
Tell us more.
Yeah, so men... So I think the classic view of someone with ADHD prior to the last couple of years where a lot more information has come out about it was kind of a very hyperactive child. And ADHD is kind of associated with children, particularly male children, can't sit still, always run around, always being disruptive. And that is the hyperactive side of ADHD, which presents, as I understand it, more commonly in men. I'm not a scientist, so I can't, but that's from my reading, that's what I understand. Whereas in women, it's the inattentive side, which tends to present more, which is a completely different side of ADHD. So yes. I don't have physical hyperactivity. I can quite happily sit for hours. I don't need to get up every 5 seconds and run around. I'm a little bit fidgety, I would say, just with my fingers, but I'm not the type of person that needs to run around, and I can't sit still. But I have real trouble focusing on things for a long period of time, particularly if they're not things that have a high dopamine level associated with them. So, and that was a real problem I had in school, which is why I didn't do so well in my A-levels. I'm sure that's the reason now, because I did really struggle in school to concentrate. And that's the kind of more inattentive side, where you can sit still for hours and you can be listening to a conversation, but actually your brain is going in 20,000 different directions and you haven't heard a single word that's being said to you. That's the kind of inattentive side, which is much more what I struggle with, the inattention rather than the hyperactivity. But I've resolved that to a certain extent by now kind of tailoring my career to actually doing things that fundamentally I'm very interested in most of the time. And that's why I've sort of built the life that I've built, which has, involves me wearing many different hats, actually, because that's actually what keeps me engaged in things, is having lots of different things which kind of appeal to lots of different sides of my talents and skill set. And my brain gets a lot of stimulation from those things. So I've had to kind of manage that. And now I understand that it's all linked to dopamine. I can regulate myself a little better. I know that in the mornings I have to first thing I need to do is a high dopamine task, because that will then carry me through some of the lower dopamine tasks. So lower dopamine tasks for me are administrative tasks, basically. Just kind of basic stuff around the house. Yeah, just kind of replying to emails, which, are just kind of standard emails that don't require any particularly complex replies, just the normal kind of stuff. Any like paying bills, all of that kind of stuff, that is very low dopamine for me. And I really struggle with it because effectively my brain needs to hit a certain level of dopamine to function. And that's what executive dysfunction is. Effectively, if my brain hasn't hit that level of dopamine, then I just can't do a task. I will sit and I'll stare at a laptop or I'll stare out the window. But if my brain isn't stimulated enough, it's just it doesn't work. I'm telling it to do these tasks, but it's just not doing them. And that's what I struggle with a lot when it comes to kind of routine tasks. But now I know that actually if I start the day with kind of high dopamine activities and high dopamine tasks and kind of get that spike up in the morning, then actually if I can then sort of use that to ride out the admin tasks in the afternoon. Whereas before, a big piece of advice that was given to me, which is a very commonly given piece of advice, but it's actually the worst piece of advice anyone could give me, was to eat the frog. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase.
Yeah,
eat the frog, which
do
is
the hardest
do
thing
the hardest
first.
thing first. And that is the absolute worst advice for me, because I won't ever do it, because I need dopamine first to do that task. So if I just try and do the hard task, I won't do it. And that's what always used to happen. I should try and do the hard task first, and I would spend the whole day trying to do the hard task and never finish it.
Hard for you is actually what you would probably consider easy.
Well,
would you?
It depends how you define hard. Yeah. So in my mind, a hard task is something that my brain doesn't want to do. It's hard. It's not necessarily hard in terms of complex, because you're right. Actually, things which are complex are easy for me to do because my brain has.
That's what I was getting
so hard, like quote unquote hard things for me to do are things which actually most people would find very straightforward. You know, in terms of admin or in terms of something that's going to be, you know, it's going to take a long period of time and it's not particularly interesting or engaging. Like that's my idea of something that's really, really hard to do for me. And my interpretation of Eat the Frog was try and do that thing first. But actually that thing would just never get done when I started with that, because I didn't have the requisite level of dopamine to complete that task. So it's basically just banging my head against a brick wall. Whereas actually for me, what I need to do is kind of get the quick wins in the morning, do things which are really interesting, which I'm going to execute quickly, get that dopamine up. I now go to the gym first thing. I never used to be a morning gym person, but actually that's kind of a source of dopamine for me. So actually doing those things in the morning, you know, get my dopamine levels up. And then if I've got to do a hard task, i.e. kind of an administrative task, I can do that once I've kind of got that level up a little bit. So that really works for me. Everybody's different. You know, I've said that to other people with ADHD and they're like, no, that's not the way I do things at all. So it's not the same fit for everyone. And I think there is a big difference between people who medicate and who don't, because the medication does even out your dopamine levels. So I think you don't need as much management around that. But, you know, that's for someone who knows more about medication to say. But certainly the way I choose to manage is kind of get my high dopamine things in the morning. And then if I've got kind of harder, lower dopamine tasks, just kind of do those in the afternoon whilst I can sort of use that tailing off level of dopamine to get through.
So, Chrissie, let's say I'm an employer to the latest member of my team joining who has just disclosed that she has ADHD and she's been really brave about disclosure, and I'm really excited to welcome her to the team. But I want to make sure that I accommodate that, and not only accommodate it, I want her to be a rock star. You know, I want her ADHD to actually be leveraged in the most supportive and beautiful way within the organization. Teach me what I need to do and what I need to know.
Yeah, I think it depends kind of what sort of what stage they're at as well, because actually a lot of people might come to you not even really knowing all of their strengths and weaknesses. So I think a lot of it is a bit of trial and error, and they may well not know it in the context of that job, even if they knew it in their previous job. If it's a new job, it's going to take a little bit of time to actually work out that relationship and actually how this job can cater to their strengths and weaknesses if there's somebody who's a bit more junior perhaps. So I think it's kind of being open at the beginning to working with someone and saying, and keeping under constant review and saying, okay, what's working for you? You know, what tasks are you really enjoying? What are you good at? What do you know, and then actually figuring out as well, okay, why are you struggling with that? That's taking you a bit longer. I've had to chase you for that task a couple of times, whereas this task you've delivered 3 days early, and knowing like, okay, obviously that's where your strengths are, because I'm like that. If I'm super interested in something, I will go away and I'll do hundreds of pages of research and hours and hours and hours on it, and I'll deliver, you know, this incredibly complicated, very well researched document. If it's something I'm not interested in, you know, I will just kind of let it sit there until someone forces me to do it. And that's an indication of kind of what is my superpower and what isn't. Because if it's my superpower, I'll just get it done and it will be amazing and, it'll be 10 times more detailed and better than you ever expected. And if it's not something that's kind of in my superpower, then it will be something that you have to chase me for a few times and you'll probably be disappointed with the result. And then it's like looking at that and saying, okay, your talent is here. So actually, let's capitalize. Let's give you more of that. Let's give you more of that kind of stuff. And it also is about looking at, was there a particular environment? Is it about the task, or did you do that task when you were working from home, and did you try and do this task in the office when you were distracted? So it's kind of about, analysing that. And I think that's what good managers really do, because I think really good managers should be about people rather than about the subject matter. And I think that's where law falls down a lot, actually, because you have managers who are great lawyers who have been promoted into management positions, but they don't necessarily know anything about people and how to spot personality types and how to really bring the best talent out of people. They're just really, really good at billing. But actually that has no bearing on whether they're any good at actually getting the best out of people necessarily. But I think it's really about kind of working with the individuals and talent mapping to an extent, and actually saying, I can see where your talents are, so I'm going to put you in a role which really capitalizes on those talents, and actually you're not so good at that. So maybe we bring someone else in on that to do that kind of work, or if we can't bring someone else in to do that kind of work, let's change your environment or let's change the structure of that task so that it works for you in a slightly different way. So I make a lot of content on social media. And sometimes if I was doing boring tasks, I would actually video myself doing it and make content out of it, because it would actually make me do it. If I was on camera, if I had to do a load of emails, I really didn't want to do them, I'd be like, right, I'm going to set my camera up and I'm going to do like a day in the life video of this. And because the camera was rolling, I'd be like, right, I need to do these things in like the next 2 or 3 minutes, and then I can edit and then I can make a video out of it. And it changed the task for me, because this is no longer me sending 5 boring emails. This is me making a piece of content.
So
now.
It becomes interesting.
So it becomes interesting.
This is brilliant.
So this is how I've learned to work my brain out, because if something is not working, I'm like, okay, we have to make this task into a high dopamine task somehow. And if it's not, because otherwise I'm not going to get through it. And sometimes that involves either just like, okay, you know what, I'm going to go for a quick run before I do it and just spike my dopamine and then I'll get through it. Or, I'm going to edit a quick video and put that up and then I'm going to be able to do it. So it involves there's no point in me just trying to do something that my brain obviously doesn't want to do. And I refer to my brain in third person because it is independent of my conscious thoughts and what I want it to do a lot of the time. So, if it's not working, there is no point in just banging my head against a brick wall and saying, right, let's just stare at this task until we do it. It's not going to work. I don't have enough dopamine to do the task. So I need to find the dopamine to do the task, basically. I need to either make the task high dopamine, or I need to do something first to spike the dopamine to get me through the task. So those are kind of my two options when I'm faced with a kind of brick wall executive dysfunction scenario. It's about changing the context of what it is, or changing my dopamine levels so that I can do it.
You've mentioned lifestyle adjustments as well, and you've referred to going to the gym, running. Is there anything else in terms of holistic lifestyle management that you find very helpful for ADHD?
Yeah, so I've changed my diet a bit as well. Because I used to be the person who, I don't drink coffee so much, but I drink a lot of tea. And my natural go-to was wake up immediately, go have a cup of tea, and I might have some like toast and jam for breakfast. And these are actually terrible for ADHD, because these kind of spikes in glucose levels are not great. So actually I've read about diet, and actually what I now do is I go to the gym first thing. So I do exercise first thing before I eat anything. And then I have a really high protein breakfast, which is really low sugar. And then I use that for the morning. And then I try not to have any caffeine or sugar until like kind of the middle of the day, which has actually helped, because actually those spikes in glucose often then lead to slumps, which then coincide with executive dysfunction. So I have managed my diet a little bit as well, which I've changed that, and that does help. I mean, I can't confess that I always stick to it, because I'm on the go a lot, and sometimes I can't always have a high protein breakfast. But when I can actually control my environment, that's what I try to do, and try and lay off the kind of sugar and caffeine until a bit later in the day now, which I never used to do before.
That's brilliant. And what would you say to someone listening in who is on the fence about getting diagnosed?
I get asked this question a lot, and I would say absolutely get diagnosed. And see and find out, because I think there is a stigma attached, or people think there is a stigma attached to being diagnosed. I don't see it that way at all. It's like having a map of your brain. It's like, you know where you want to get to, and sometimes you can't always get there in your mind, and you don't know why you can't get there. You don't know why you suffer with executive dysfunction, or things just aren't working for you. And if you get the diagnosis and you find out that you have the diagnosis, you get that map of figuring out what's the block. You understand what the block is in the way. And there's a number of different ways you can overcome that. You can choose not to overcome the block. You can choose to do nothing about it and carry on as you are. You could also choose to go around the block, which I think is lifestyle management, or you can choose to kind of go through the block, which is medication if you want to. But all of these things are just options that are available to you. But if you get the diagnosis, you have the map, essentially. It's then up to you what you do with it. You're not forced into doing anything with it. You don't have to do medication. You don't have to change your life if you don't want to. You don't have to tell anyone. But you have that map there, so you understand you understand what's going on, and you understand what's in the way, and then it's completely up to you what you do with it. But otherwise, if you don't get that map, you're just standing in the middle of the road, unable to go, not understanding what the block is or how you're going to get to where you need to get to. So for me, I just think getting the diagnosis just gives you that understanding of what's going on. And then it's completely up to you what you do with that, whether you want to act on it or not, whether you want to tell people or not, whether you want to medicate or not. But that information is gold in terms of really understanding how your brain works. So for me, I don't see any reason not to get that map of your brain and understand how it works.
And what I find fascinating about what you're saying is that notion of how your brain works. And what I find interesting when I have this conversation with clients who haven't been yet diagnosed is, well, how do I know how my brain works compared to how another brain works? Because that's always been my reality. Mm-hmm. So what would you say to them, having been on both sides of the fence, pre-diagnosis, post-diagnosis, now that you know so much about it, what can you say in terms of little signs, little things that are actually are telltale sign, but we tend to normalize because in the end, that's our brain, right? And that's the only brain we know. So what could you tell them in terms of helping them identify perhaps?
Yeah, so that's a great point, because I spent, the first 34 years of my life just assuming that my brain was just my brain.
Right.
Every brain is different. I struggle with these things, and I assumed that sort of my strengths and weaknesses were just natural nuances of my own brain. And to a certain extent, that kind of is what ADHD is. It is a kind of a set of strengths and weaknesses, but it's governed by, effectively your brain being wired in a different way, in kind of general terms. But I would say, if you are struggling with something, get it checked out. If there is something that you feel like you are struggling with, whether it's a task at work that you seemingly can't do. The big thing for me was I really struggled with time recording at work. And it was really frustrating for me because I was a good litigator. I was really good at my job. I built lots of costs and brought in lots of work and, won lots of cases and was really, really interested in, I was always really, really good at kind of the complex litigation side. But I was just terrible at time recording. No matter what I did, I could never seem to get beyond kind of 5-ish hours on my timesheet. And my target was always basically 7 hours a day to account for annual leave and all sorts of things.
When in reality, you did work
and
above those hours.
I did, yeah. And I was the person who was at my desk the longest. I was always the last one in the office, and I felt like I was working all day, but I was like, I don't understand why I can't find these hours to record. And it was something that I just accepted, but it was frustrating because I'm seeing around me everyone can do it. Why can't I do it? Everyone around me is kind of hitting their time target. Why? My boss was always like, just hit your time target, just do it. I'm like, I want to do it. It's not that I don't. And I obviously am really hardworking, but for whatever reason, I just can't. And it was frustrating for me to be in that position because I felt like I was excelling in all other aspects of my job and, deserved to be excelling. But there was just this one thing that was holding me back. And actually it was a post that I saw on Instagram. I think it was Jodie Hill who shared,
yes.
Who basically listed some, lesser known signs of ADHD. I'd known she had ADHD for a long time, but I hadn't ever considered that I would have it because, again, I had that kind of generic image of my mind of a hyperactive child running around. I'm not hyperactive at all. Actually, most people would say I'm kind of horizontal in terms of how I am, how I present on a day-to-day basis. So never crossed my mind. Then she put up this kind of list of things that were kind of lesser known signs. And it was just, I mean, everything that was on there was me.
Tick, tick, tick.
Yeah. And it was like struggling with kind of like routine administrative tasks, you know, not getting bills paid on time. One of hers was actually time recording, like struggling to focus on one thing at a time, having like 20 tabs open on your laptop. And it was just like this kind of like very horrifying moment where I thought, is someone watching me? Is someone watching my life? Is she watching me? And has she just taken these things and put them on a slide? Because none of those things had I ever associated with ADHD, because I didn't understand the inattentive side. I knew very little about it and understood it to be hyperactivity, which I don't have. But when I really realized it was this struggling to focus, I realized that this kind of struggle to focus kind of underpinned actually everything that I struggled with. And you know, having a million tabs open at once is because I can't focus on one at a time. I go through all of them and then go back to the first one. And actually that's why I struggled with time recording, because I would be doing so many tasks at the same time that I wouldn't really be monitoring my time on all of them, because I'd do like one sentence of an email, and then I'd do like one paragraph of a document, and then I'd do like 5 minutes of research, and then I'd circle back and finish the email and then do that. So I wasn't ever like recording on one thing. And the essence of time recording is that you start the timer when you start the task, you stop the timer when you finish the task. But I was never doing that one task. I was doing 10 tasks at a time. So I could never use the actual timer, because I was never working on one document. So that, and it really, once I understood that it was this attention, basically the surplus of attention. I had a lot of people say it's called attention deficit, but it's actually attention surplus, really, which results in it being a deficit on any one task, because you've got a surplus, you're doing 20 tasks at the same time. And that's effectively how it's characterized. So when I saw that, I realised that this kind of struggle to focus was really what underpinned, you know, everything that I was struggling with. And that's when I started researching it more, and I found more and more things and more people that presented very similar to me that had ADHD. And it took me about a year and a half, I think, before I finally went for the diagnosis, because I wasn't sure I wanted it. You know, you're not really sure you want that label. I mean, it was a label to have ADHD, and I don't know whether I wanted it. And then I eventually came to the conclusion, you know, as I've just described it, in terms of saying I want to understand my brain. Like, I don't see how understanding my brain can be a bad thing. You know, I want to be successful. I'm ambitious, and you know, I've got these blocks in the way, and there's potentially a way of understanding how to remove those blocks. Why would I not do that? You know, I can't go through my whole life thinking perhaps there was a way of removing those blocks and I didn't do it. So that's kind of the point where I got to, where I then got the diagnosis, because I wanted to know for sure whether there was a way of resolving those issues.
Chrissie, thank you. This has been such an enlightening conversation, and I really hope that it empowers everyone listening to help, whether you do have ADHD, whether you don't know, and whether you're employing somebody who does, because I think that's really so important.
Yeah.
I would love to ask you to wrap up our conversation about your new role, which is really exciting, and also what would be the best way for our listener to get into your world.
Yeah, so I do have a new role. I'm very excited to have a new role. So I've joined a platform law firm called Nexa as a partner, where I'm now running my litigation practice.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
I feel like we should have champagne, not coffee, for this episode.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really exciting. And also, you know, a kind of testament to these new models of practice, because I don't think I would have enjoyed life as a partner in traditional practice for the various reasons, you know, that we've talked about, and particularly the ADHD, whether I question whether I ever would have been able to kind of flourish up to that level. So actually, the great thing about these kind of alternative platforms is that you are effectively self-employed. You bring in your own cases and you work in a way which completely suits you. So I can use whatever technology I want. I can hire who I want. I can work from whatever country or cafe I want to. And I can do my work in the middle of the night or the beginning of the day, or, you know, and that... You know, that really is something which has been super helpful to me and my productivity, being able to run the cases in the way which really kind of plays to my strengths, and not having to run them in kind of conjunction with other people's targets or other people's structures. Or so I think being able to do it like this, and I'm so grateful to these to have these kind of alternative ways of practicing law now, and alternative ways of being a partner, having a caseload, litigating at a high level, which doesn't actually involve being in a kind of traditional corporate structure, which is one that I didn't thrive in. And I do think that corporate structure is changing now. But for me, I kind of almost gave up hope of kind of ever being in that position because I worried that I had too many barriers ahead of me. But now being able to do it in this way has kind of helped me to kind of really get back to where I want to be, which is litigating, without kind of having to worry about all of my weaknesses so much, because I can manage those much better in the context of being self-employed than employed. Well, that's what I found anyway.
This is such an inspiring story, and I think it's full of hope as well for everyone listening that may wonder, am I still going to make it as a partner, if that's the goal, of course.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would definitely encourage anyone listening, if you love being a lawyer, but you are not loving the structure that you're in, then to explore others. There are so many ways to practice law now. There is obviously still the traditional private practice route. There's in-house, there's platform firms, there's ALSPs, there's boutiques, there's endless ways which are all completely different. So I would definitely encourage anyone to look beyond traditional practice or beyond wherever they are, whichever model they're in, try another one if you're not flourishing in that model, but you still do want to progress and you still love the law. Because I know so many people that left the law, but they really left private practice and never tried anything else, and I think probably would have continued and thrived if they tried a different model.
Well, it's not every day that you meet such an incredible lawyer who is as talented as you are and also completely blew up on TikTok and made partner. What a beautiful combo, Chrissie. I think you're an inspiration for us all.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening in. I have a quick question for you now. What do you want to hear from me for our new latest episodes? Just give me a quick comment and let me know what you would like to hear about. Which topic are you passionate about? Which topic do you feel we haven't covered yet and you really want us to cover? Please let me know. This show is for you, and I want to know what you want to listen to. I can't wait to hear your feedback. Thank you.